When was the last time you were truly alone and felt okay with it? Not scrolling on your phone, not replying to messages, not trying to look busy. Just you and the silence. If you're listening to this podcast right now, it might be nighttime. Soft lights, everything around you has slowed down after a long day, and it's in moments like these that we often feel the most uncomfortable. Because being alone has long carried an uneasy meaning. We learn, even if no one says it directly, that being alone is sad, that it means a lack, that something must be wrong. We rarely say the sentence, "I'm spending this weekend alone," with confidence. Usually we lower our voice, or rush to explain, or joke it away, as if being alone needs a valid excuse. From a very young age, we're taught that a good life is a life where there's always someone by your side. Friends, relationships, a packed schedule, laughter. Happiness, as society describes it, is when someone is always choosing you, sitting next to you, texting you, caring about you. And when that doesn't happen, even for a short while, a familiar question begins to appear in your mind. Is there something I'm lacking? Is something wrong with me? Maybe you've felt this before. You open the door and step into your room after a long day. No voices, no new messages, no one asked how your day was. And instead of feeling relieved, your chest feels heavy. Not because you're sad, but because the silence is too noticeable. So you turn on the TV, play some music, scroll aimlessly through your phone, anything, just so you don't have to be fully yourself. Because deep down, what we fear isn't really being alone. We fear what shows up when there's nothing left to distract us, when there's no role to play, no one to please, nothing to cover up our thoughts. There's only you, with thoughts you haven't named, emotions you haven't resolved, questions without answers. And that can feel heavy. In today's world, being alone is sometimes seen as a failure. Social media constantly reminds us of how other people are living, where they're going, who they're with. Couples, friend groups, lively weekends, and even without meaning to, we compare ourselves. Then we start believing that being alone means not being chosen, not being important enough, or falling behind. But what if that story isn't complete? What if being alone isn't always a sign of lack, but sometimes a sign that something is beginning? What if solitude isn't a punishment, but an invitation? An invitation to slow down, to listen, to meet the parts of yourself you've neglected while constantly trying to blend into the world. Because there's something we rarely say out loud. You can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely. And you can be alone and feel an unexpected sense of peace. Being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. One is the pain of disconnection. The other is simply the absence of someone beside you in that moment. One hurts, the other can heal. But we rarely give ourselves the chance to tell the difference. We rush to fill the emptiness, rush to prove that we're needed. Rush to escape the silence. Because somewhere along the way, we learned that silence is dangerous, that if we stop, if we don't connect, if we're not busy, we'll have to face something uncomfortable. But what if what's waiting there isn't fear? What if it's clarity, rest, a version of you that has been patiently waiting to be heard? Right now, wherever you're sitting, I want to invite you to hold this question a little longer. No judgment, no rushing to answer. Just listen. Why does being alone make us so uncomfortable? And why isn't it always a bad thing? Maybe the problem was never that you're alone, but that we were never taught how to be alone without feeling like we're losing something. To understand why being alone makes so many people feel deeply uncomfortable, we need to look a little deeper, not to judge ourselves, but to understand ourselves better. Because the fear of being alone is not something natural. It is formed, it is nurtured, and it is repeated through many life experiences. Being alone forces us to face ourselves. From a psychological perspective, the human brain does not like emptiness. When everything around us becomes quiet, when external stimulation fades, the mind begins to turn inward. And that is when thoughts arise, the thoughts we deliberately avoid during the day, unanswered questions, unprocessed emotions. When we are alone, there's nowhere left to hide, no conversations to distract us, no work to cover up our exhaustion, no roles to perform convincingly. There's only our true self left. And that is not always comfortable, because many of us have lived facing outwards for too long, used to being a version of ourselves that looks okay to others, used to meeting expectations, used to pleasing people. So much so that when we are finally alone, we no longer know what to do with ourselves. We don't know what we like, we don't know what we need, we don't know where this feeling comes from. That confusion turns being alone into a frightening experience. Being alone forces us to face ourselves. Another psychological cause, deeper and harder to recognize, is the fear of abandonment. This fear does not necessarily come from a major event. Sometimes it comes from very small moments. It might be when you were a child and your emotions were not listened to. It might be when you desperately needed someone, but they weren't there. It might be relationships that ended in silence. Over time, the brain learns one thing: being alone is unsafe. And in order to protect you, it pushes you to seek the presence of others. Not because you're weak, but because you're trying to feel safe. That's why sometimes we cling to unhealthy relationships, stay in places where we can no longer be ourselves, simply because being alone feels even scarier. We confuse being alone with loneliness. Many people say they hate being alone, but in reality, they hate loneliness. Loneliness is when you feel misunderstood, disconnected, unseen, and that feeling can arise even when you're surrounded by many people. But because these two concepts often appear together, we begin to equate them. Being alone equals loneliness. Loneliness equals something bad. And so we try to avoid being alone at all costs. When the truth is, being alone is simply an external state, while loneliness is an internal emotional experience. You can be alone and still feel connected to yourself, and you can also always have someone by your side, yet still feel empty. Modern society makes being alone feel unnormal. Beyond individual psychological factors, we also live in a society that is not very friendly towards quietness. Modern society glorifies busyness, glorifies constant connection, always being present, always being online. If your schedule is empty, people ask, "Why are you so free lately?" If you have no plans for the weekend, people ask, "Aren't you going anywhere?" Being alone, invisibly, is seen as a sign of lack, a lack of friends, a lack of relationships, a lack of social life. Rarely does anyone ask, "Do you need some time for yourself?" Social media amplifies that fear. We constantly see the best moments of other people's lives, parties, trips, hugs, and we rarely see the empty moments, the quiet nights, the moments of confusion. That makes us believe, "I'm the only one who is alone." The comparison happens quietly but continuously, and gradually, being alone stops being a choice and becomes a source of shame.
6. We're taught how to love others, but not how to be with ourselves. Something very important, yet rarely spoken about. We learn so much about how to build relationships with others, but almost no one teaches us how to build a relationship with ourselves. No one teaches us how to sit with our emotions, how to listen to our own thoughts without judgment. No one teaches us that being alone does not mean failure. So when there's no one beside us, we feel lost, not because we are not good enough, but because we were never guided. 7. Being alone can be a transition, not an ending. Another, gentler perspective. Many important stages in life are accompanied by being alone. When you were changing, when you were letting go, when you were growing. Between the old and the new, there is often a gap, and that gap can be very quiet. But quiet does not mean empty. Sometimes it is where everything is being rearranged. 8. The problem is not that you are alone, but how you see it. When looking back at all of this, you may begin to realize being alone is not the enemy. It is simply reflecting your relationship with yourself. If you feel panic when you are alone, it may be a sign that you have neglected yourself for too long. If you feel empty, you may be needing a deeper connection, not with others, but with yourself. Being alone is not a sentence, it is an invitation to understand more clearly why you feel the way you do and what you truly need. If you've been listening up to this point, there's probably a very familiar feeling inside you right now. Not exactly sadness, not exactly happiness either, but a quiet stillness, as if something is slowly being put back into its rightful place. Maybe, for the first time in a long while, you're no longer looking at being alone with such a harsh gaze. And that alone is already a very important step. Because being alone, when seen deeply enough, is not an absence. It is a space for you to breathe more slowly, to stop having to be someone else, to no longer need to explain, prove, or try, just to be yourself. Being alone does not mean you are unloved. It does not mean you have been left behind. It does not mean you are less valuable than those who have someone by your side. Sometimes it simply means you are in a phase where life is gently pulling you back toward yourself, and perhaps that is not a bad thing. In a world that is always loud, always demanding, always pushing you to be faster, better, more, being able to sit alone without feeling afraid is a very quiet kind of strength. It shows that you are learning how to be with yourself without needing to run away, that you are brave enough to listen to what is happening inside, patient enough to not rush to fill every empty space. And if right now you still don't feel comfortable being alone, that's okay too. You don't have to love solitude right away. You don't have to turn it into something positive immediately. Just don't see it as an enemy. Start very small, maybe an evening without turning on the TV, a walk without wearing headphones, 5 minutes of sitting still and asking yourself, how do I really feel today? You don't need a perfect answer, just an honest one. Because the longest relationship of your life is not with anyone else, it is with yourself. And if you cannot be alone without feeling empty, without feeling afraid, without the need to run somewhere, then it is very difficult for any other relationship to fill that for you. Being alone is not about cutting yourself off from the world. It is about returning more whole before stepping out to connect again. There are people who enter your life not to save you from loneliness, but to walk alongside a version of you who has learned how to stand firmly on your own. And there are periods in life when no one is beside you, not because you are unworthy, but because you are growing in a very quiet way. So if today you are alone, please don't rush to see it as a flaw. Who knows, this might be the moment when you are being given back something very precious: time, space, and the chance to truly listen to yourself. And perhaps one day when you look back, you will realize the time you spent alone was not when you lost the most. It was when you began to find yourself the most. Thank you for spending these moments being here, listening, and being with yourself. If this podcast episode touched you, allow yourself to stay still a little longer before returning to the world. Because sometimes Peace does not come from having someone else, but from the moment you stop abandoning yourself.